Writing Environmental Justice. The presentation by Dr. Beronda Montgomery. It is with such respect and joy that I introduce Dr. Montgomery to Riverside Writing Group. By now, because you've gathered in this space today, you've seen Dr. Montgomery's bio. So you have a snapshot of her outstanding scholarship, environmental activism, and her writing. Yes, she earned her PhD at UC Davis, is a microbiologist, is a plant scientist and researcher. And wait, she's also an activist for plants, for Earth's environment. And she is an activist for Blacks who study plants, who champion plants. I didn't even know that was a thing until I discovered that Dr. Montgomery is a co-founder of Black Botanists Week. And Dr. Montgomery is a writer. She's the author of Lessons from Plants, published just last year in 2021 by Harvard University Press. Okay, that's the snapshot. Now my more personal narrative, why I respect Dr. Montgomery and find her work and her activism so joy-filled. And that is because she is both a writer and scientist. Dr. Montgomery, to me, is the epitome of creative imagination. She sees what others can look at, but perhaps not see as she is able to see, to imagine, to recognize, to know. I discovered a video interview in which Dr. Montgomery tells the story of how she resisted visiting a Southern plantation, despite her son's pleas, until once there, she's standing by a gigantic oak tree, about 600 years old. And writer-scientist that she is, she says she begins to see, to appreciate that those trees may contain the breath of her enslaved forebears, her enslaved ancestors. From that moment, I knew instantly that I wanted to welcome Dr. Montgomery, writer, plant scientist, environmental activist, to our Riverside Writing Group to talk with us about writing environmental justice. So welcome, Dr. Montgomery. Welcome to the Riverside Church and to our justice writing space.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope that you can hear me well. And if that changes, let me know by unmuting or giving me a moment in the chat. I would hate to lose you because you can't hear me. And so it is a real honor and privilege to be here with you tonight. I recognize that any time that people take to be in community is a privilege. There are many places that we could be. And so I never take it lightly when I have an invitation, but also when people show up and it's not just me and the person who invited me in this space. So thanks again for the invitation. As I was listening to the very generous introduction and you spoke, Lavon, of how I am a plant activist, that stopped me for a moment because I think so much that plants have more acted on my behalf than I have acted on theirs. And so I really do engage every part of my life through a principle of reciprocity. And so I hope that I do them honor as they have really helped me become more of the person I believe I'm intended to be, even as I still have work to do. So I was invited to talk to you about writing environmental justice, and I accepted that invitation gracefully, but also humbly, because when I wrote this book was, I think it was a love letter of sorts to both plants and to my mother. So the first botanist that I knew is not a professional trained botanist. My mom is certainly a botanist. Growing up, there were plants inside and outside of our home. Still now, whatever block she lives on, her yard is the prize of whatever neighborhood she's in. So I watched my mom lovingly attend to plants and had no real interest in them until I became a professional plant scientist. So part of writing this book was an invitation to connect with my mother. But in the effort of writing this book, I have been called a social justice writer, an environmental justice writer, and I accept all of those because I do believe in a just world. And I believe that all of us, whether we're on the side of privilege or the oppressed, have responsibility to move towards justice collectively. So for me, writing environmental justice really is about this sign in the back, where any form of justice, to me, climate justice, environmental justice, is about human justice. It's about planetary justice. It's about justice for living beings. And while I'm certainly a human, the older I get, I recognize that more than that, I'm a living being. And I have embraced a broader kinship of other living beings, which is why you'll see that I talk about plants and think about plants quite differently. So I always like to start with a definition, because if we had time and we're meeting in person and asked the definition of environmental justice, we might get more than one definition, or we might get one of the more common definitions that's shared about environmental justice. And that's really being about equitable distribution of environmental risk and benefits. And I really like those definitions that focus on risk and benefits, because frequently in our conversations about environmental justice, we rightfully so focus on mediating people's exposure to risk, which is critically important. But it's also important that we understand that real environmental justice also is not just about getting rid of risk, but there are real benefits to having engagement with a healthy environment. And so I really do like to focus on both sides of what environmental justice means. And I first came to know about environmental justice when I was an undergrad through meeting one of the pioneers of environmental justice that I was aware of, environmental racism, Robert Bullard. And so I also think about how when you talk about people who have worked in this space for so long, it's the equitable distribution, but it's about those benefits and the burdens or risks in all aspects of our life, at home, at work, where we learn, where we spend leisure time. And again, I like to focus on those because when you're able to understand it as related to not just work and home, but also where you're learning both formally and informally, it takes us back to understanding the importance of mitigating risk, but really amplifying benefits as well. So the benefits are benefits that we're aware of from being able to be in space. That's the joy that we get. I saw a lot of joy in terms of which plants were blooming in the chat. I saw there was a plant, a hope. Isn't that a lovely name? I name my plants. I don't name any of them hope, but that's lovely. So there is this kind of joy that we get, but there are also emotional, psychological benefits from having access to environmental spaces, green space, clean air, clean water. And so investing in really limiting the risk, but also amplifying the benefits is about people's life in the moment, but it's also about their larger life, not only the physical life that you can have harm to if you're in pollution-rich environments, but also the emotional and mental benefits that come from being able to be in environmentally pleasing spaces. We focus a lot on the burdens, the risks to health, and I think it's critically important that we focus on that because those are not equitably distributed, and the hazards. But there are other environmental burdens. And I think that, you know, as I listen to land acknowledgements, I'm always reminded of the burden and sorrow that comes for Indigenous people around looking at how their land has been taken. And that's not always just due to a pollution, it's about a separation from land. And the story that Lavon shared about my not wanting to visit a plantation was part of the environmental burden that I think many African Americans share. There's a land trauma from having been brought to a land against your will and having to toil. And so part of environmental burdens are the immediate physical burdens, but there are also those larger burdens that allow people to, I think, live to their fullest potential. So as I said, I came to know about work first from Robert Bullard, who often talked about environmental justice as environmental racism. And I think it's important to bring that kind of root of environmental justice to my own memory frequently, because we can often get so caught up in the environmental injustice that we just want to fix the environment without understanding that there are underlying roots of racism, bias that really drive the planning, the decision-making that leads to the ultimate environmental justice that we are passionate about. And we know that racism really influences the likelihood of exposure to environmental and health risks, because land that is likely to be near pollution or unvaluable is land that is often redlined for minoritized and marginalized people to have access to. And all of these things are linked both to negative health outcomes from living there, but also we find that the racism drives whether there's healthcare available in those spaces as well. So for me, I have to remember the roots of environmental justice so that you can get at the root when you're trying to get at solutions to this. And as Robert Bullard said in 1993, and he will tell you today if you have a chance to talk with him, racism really has in our country and globally in many cases provided white individuals of all class levels with an edge in terms of gaining access to healthy spaces, spaces that have good and healthy environments, but also spaces that also have good healthcare. And so I think that the importance of focusing on this is that, as I started to say in the last slide, having access to healthy environments is not only about having a healthy life in that moment, but it affects future life outcomes. And as we've come to understand, actually affects generational health and what we see as intergenerational health disparities that can happen. And so I mention all of these things because these things remind me how critically important and urgent it is for us to deeply understand environmental justice and to understand it from many different aspects. And I say that because the aspect with which I come to my environmental justice work is different from a lot of places and views that people come to this work, but I think we have to have a 360-degree view of environmental justice to get to real solutions and to get to them in one of my favorite words, expeditiously. We can't continue to limp towards solutions to environmental justice. I think all of us are seeing climate change, pandemics, and other things that are coming that say we have to get to these things more quickly. So ultimately, my work really does sit as at a nexus, I would say, of social justice. And I know you've had the opportunity to talk about this in your writing community, but it sits at a nexus of social justice and environmental justice. And that is because in all of my work around environmental justice, I'm going back to the fact that the root of a lot of this is racism and capitalism. And those are social justice issues. So even as you're addressing issues of environmental justice, if we're going to truly solve them and not just make them slightly better, we have to get at the underlying causes. And so my work really does sit at that nexus. And so in this regard, social justice, in a very common definition, this one is drawn from one of the Forest Research spaces in the UK, social justice is really promoting a fair distribution of advantages and disadvantages within a society, regardless of background and status. And my work sits there and at the interface of environmental justice, which again is dealing with the distribution of benefits and burdens that people experience in environments at home, work, where they learn, play, or spend leisure time. And so for me at this nexus, I believe it works for me to function in that space because I truly believe we can't adequately or significantly address environmental justice without boldly and collectively engaging the underlying systemic issues, including racism. And I say boldly and collectively, but I also appreciated part of the statement that Maitri read initially, which is that there's discomfort in some of the work that we do. And I constantly invite people to lean into and walk through discomfort. And when we start to talk about environmental justice sitting really deeply in racism, that makes some people uncomfortable. They'd like to focus on cleaning up the environment. But if we do that without fixing the underlying structures, we clean up things temporarily, and then the underlying systems of bias, racism, and inequities take us back slowly to that original state. So I think that it is a human nature, particularly around issues as triggering as racism and sexism and genderism and the biases we have about religion and gender expression, that we get very uncomfortable in those spaces. And I often use the example, one of my dear colleagues at work is a white man who we have spent working together 10 years doing some very critical work. And we had to have a relationship that as we started to talk about race, it wasn't his greatest fear that I was about to call him a racist, but that it was his greatest fear that he would be uncomfortable, but not face that comfort and grow. And likewise for other biases that I have. And so I really do appreciate that invitation. And it's an invitation I often have that if I make you uncomfortable tonight, I've done my job. And hopefully I make myself uncomfortable because we all have growth that we need to continue to do. So ultimately, I come to this work as a professional plant scientist, not an environmental scientist, but I work with plants really trying to understand how these organisms that spend their entire life cycle in one spot, how that translates to them needing to be really critically aware of what's going on around them and being able to adjust their behaviors and responses. So I always use the example, I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and in July, I always wanted to leave and visit my grandmother in the north because summers in Arkansas are miserable. But plants don't have that option. Wherever they are, they have to spend their entire life cycle there. And so they have to learn to adapt. And now as I live in Michigan, every winter, I am amazed at the plants that persist in winter because I go outside for about 10 minutes in January and really question my life choices and know that I have to continue to work to provide a warm environment. So I've been fascinated with plants for this reason, that they are what I think of as very clever and very adaptable. And a lot of the lessons, this is actually the phenomenon that I study as a plant scientist, but I show you this picture because the work that I do in environmental justice, the work that I do in pursuing equity in spaces is also founded in looking at this picture. So I saw this picture first in September, I think it was September 15th or 16th of 1996. So approaching 26 years ago, it was the very first week of my being a PhD student at UC Davis. And I was trying to decide which professor I was going to work with. And the professor that showed this picture was so excited about this. I had not seen anyone this excited about something for a long time. And so I ultimately wanted to understand his enthusiasm and excitement. And I too am excited about this. I continue to work on it. And I trust that most of you will not be as excited as I am, but I'm going to tell you what we're looking at so some of you can join me in my excitement. Okay. So these two seedlings are beans and they're twins. They're identically identical twins. They've been exposed to almost identical environments. So they're on the same soil. They've had access to the same amount of water, the identical humidity, temperature, nutrient profile. All things are almost equal. There's only one thing different between these two plants, and it's that this plant that's tall and white to yellow has spent its life in the darkness. And all things being almost equal, this plant that's been exposed to light, they look very different. And they're very different in terms of what behaviors they're exhibiting. This one is growing very tall. This one is not growing tall, but is instead using its energy to make leaves, the equivalent of solar panels. And so this plant that's been exposed to what is a critical factor for plants has been able to transition from something that's dependent upon the nutrients and sugars that I say were lovingly packed by the mother plant in the seed to being an independent organism. This organism will now have a full life because it's able to use sunlight during the process of photosynthesis to make sugars for itself. So I study this biochemically, but every time I look at this picture, it makes me think about equity and environmental justice. And why is that? It's because these two organisms are identical, but because they've had access to two environments, one that's been in a suboptimal environment and another that's been in a pristine environment, they have distinctly different outcomes. And so the importance of the external environment to whether a plant has a really short life cycle versus one that's in an almost identical environment, but it has access to the critical thing it needs and now is able to have a full life and to even start a new generation by making seeds, reminds me, and this is one of what I call lessons from plants, things that I've learned from plants about how to be better on the planet. And that's the idea that this particular phenomenon always reminds me of the importance of the environment. And that's the idea that the environment matters so much more than our aptitude. If we show up with similar aptitude, then we can have vastly different outcomes depending on what's going on in the external environment. And this reminds me of environmental justice because I truly believe that although many of us would like to convince ourselves that humans have this vastly different aptitude, that we come here with a very similar aptitude. And it's the environments that we're in that can either have all of the critical factors we need to support our growth and thriving, or we are in an environment that's lacking something. And in my estimation, this picture really represents what happens if we're focused on environmental justice and identifying what critical factors are and trying to ensure that the most individuals possible are in environments where they have access to those. And so for me, I won't go into deep biology. It's too late at night to do that, although I could do it anytime, but I'm not going to do that today. But the very general thing that's happening here is something that we know happens with humans. Individuals in an environment are able to perceive that environment. For plants, they perceive whether there's light. Humans are perceiving, our bodies are perceiving whether we have enough nutrients or we're malnutritious. And once you perceive what's going on around you, there's some kind of modulation of behaviors, whether it's proteins or genes or other kinds of aspects that allow individuals to exhibit the behaviors that really lead to success. And when I started to think about what happens in our spaces that leads us towards environmental justice, how are we really interacting with each other? Humans do something very different. And we actually sort humans out based upon what we perceive their potential and outcomes are. And so we look at individuals, we look at communities, and look at outcomes. And if we have a community that is routinely struggling financially, socioeconomically, or for other reasons, we place a judgment that that is a bad community, and we do things like redlining. You're only able to live in certain parts of the city. We don't ask questions really about how they got there. Were there generations of some kind of biases? Did they come from people who were enslaved? Did they come from indigenous people whose property were taken? We simply look at outcomes, and based on our deficit model, we assume that if you work hard, you wouldn't be in that situation. And if so, you deserve to live in a part of town that may be near a lot of factories and the air is polluted. Or if you live in New Orleans, you deserve to live in a part of the city that floods more recently. And so we really do make biases, and based on our biases, we make political, legal decisions. And when and if we've decided that we want to give people an opportunity, we go in and interact with them through trying to teach them how they could have a better life or work harder to have a better life without asking questions about how our sorting of individuals or our lack of stewardship of the environment has led us there. So as I think about plants and write about environmental justice, I'm constantly going back to this image of what we know happens simply by putting individuals that are similar in very different environments and how that leads to vastly different outcomes. And what I really like to say is that we do this through lenses of biases about race and ethnicity, which we talk frequently about, but also gender expression, religious affiliation, socioeconomic status. And so I really started to ask, how can we break out of this? How can we get ourselves to understand that first, what we're doing with each other departs from what we know happens in nature with plants and other organisms. And I've been deeply inspired as a plant scientist, but also deeply inspired by human nature. And part of my inspiration has been something that I think of as awe-inspiring about humans. Humans have a relationship with plants that inspires me over and over again. And that's the idea that the vast majority of human beings on the planet interact with plants from a default expectation that plants should grow and be healthy. Most of us, if we have a plant in our home, assume that the plant is capable of growing and being healthy. And because we expect growth, we interact with the organism differently from that default expectation of growth. And how does that play out in terms of decisions that we make? Most of us, if we have a plant like this one in our home that looks pretty sad and wilted compared to its otherwise identical partner, sister, when we look at this plant, I often do this in live talks and I ask the audience what's going on here. And people give responses like the plant needs some water. People may say the plant is in an environment that's too cold or too hot. People who are really good houseplant growers and gardeners like my mother look at a plant like this one that has leaves in the middle that are yellowing and often immediately say that plant needs a Miracle-Gro. It probably has a lack of nutrients or fertilizer. Ultimately, there's usually a few people in the room who will admit that this plant probably belongs to them, because plants in their care often don't grow well because they don't have a good green thumb. The point is that the vast majority of humans on the planet, because we expect plants to grow and be healthy, when there's a departure from that, we ask questions about what's lacking in the external environment or what's lacking in our caretaking abilities that cause the plant not to grow. And so that default expectation of growth, I started to ask questions about what would happen if I personally in my life interacted with individuals independent of where they come from, expecting that my fellow human beings on the planet could grow. If we could bring these abilities that we have towards plants to our relationship with others. We really ask questions about the external environment. I often say, and people say it jokingly, but I want you to listen to this. No one would go up to this plant and say, I took a hygrometer, measured how much water is in the soil, and all the soil, though the soil is almost dry, there's a little water there. So plant, I need you to work really hard to get that trace water from the soil. Or I say to this plant, on Saturday, it's going to be a really humid day, and you have to have really good self-agency and pull yourself up by your roots and really soak up that humidity. We wouldn't try to tell this plant that it needs to work harder. We wouldn't look at this plant and say, well, unlike your neighbor, you're incapable of greening. We really would ask questions about what we could do to mediate the environment to make life better, and about our caretaking ability. So one of the beautiful things when I was growing up, because my mom could get almost any plant to grow, when my siblings and I would go out to play, there would be sickly plants on the porch, plants that looked sometimes worse than these. And it had a note that said, "Dear Miss Montgomery, you've been really good with plants. Can you nurse this plant back to health? Once the plant is healthy, call me, I'm gonna pick it up, and I want you to sit me down and tell me what you did with it, and I'll try to improve my caretaking abilities to keep it healthy." Do we do that with our fellow human beings? Or do we say, you're from a certain neighborhood, we expect this of you? We don't ask questions about whether our interactions with them could be improved. And these to me offer really deep lessons for thinking about environmental justice, and hopefully environmental justice that really strongly interfaces with social justice. Because we really recognize that if we have two plants that are in vastly different environments, like the one I showed you in the light versus the dark, or a plant that is well watered versus one that is not, we understand that the differences we see in their potential and the abilities to have success versus failure or limited success is really about the environment that they're in and the caretaking or stewardship that's available to them. So this has really inspired me, I should say, to think about environmental justice in terms of how we engage in community. So for me, I realized that engagement in community, I say should, but I offer you can, if it's your first engagement with such a topic, really should occur as environmental stewardship. And so really environmental justice for me is an invitation to be a steward of an environment to try to mitigate inequities, many which are centered in racist policies, racist legal actions, and other biased actions. And I think if you understand that environmental stewardship is an opportunity for you to learn what your role could be as a steward, but also to learn about the individuals in that environment and how you could contribute to tending the ecosystem that they're in, to really lead to equitable support of diverse individuals. Instead, what we do that maintains environmental injustice is that we frequently try to fix individuals and say to them, you're in a particular neighborhood. If you worked harder, you could move into a different neighborhood, as opposed to asking, should we be working towards making sure all of the environments have stewardship that's not focused on fixing individuals, but really to learn how to take care of the environments. And so I think a lot about how this plays out. And many of us know that a lot of the neighborhoods that might have the greatest pollution, frequently individuals from marginalized and minoritized backgrounds are much more likely to find housing in these particular environments. And there's certainly an immediate impact on their health, but there are also these broader long-term impacts in terms of health disparities, in terms of their real emotional ability to grow and engage. And I also think about, it's not just the only, a lot of times we think about these things in the immediate sense. I remember in 2005, I believe it was, when there was the Hurricane Katrina, and we were so worried in that moment. We saw the impact on many, but the impact was harder on the Ninth Ward and poor parts of New Orleans, because that's where they had put low-income housing. And so those lives were vastly disrupted. But when you look at news as recently as 2020, and if you've ever had the chance to go to New Orleans recently, much of New Orleans has recovered, but there are parts of the Ninth Ward that look like Hurricane Katrina came through very recently. And I point this out because environmental issues that are unjust and that have these racial disparities and other issues have very real impacts in the moment, but also the ways in which we respond to those, because our systems continue to have inequities. The recovery from those is different from people. And that's why for me, I can't separate the environmental issues from the racism and the bias structures, because they play together such that these have longer term impacts and multi-generational impacts on some of our populations rather than other. So where does this come back to plants? What we tell people in these areas is that you just have to figure out how to bloom where planted. And if I happen to land in fertile ground and I bloom and thrive more, and you happen not to, you just have to do the best you can to bloom where planted. And one of the ways in which I have constantly challenged these is to, again, to ask what happens with humans and interactions with plants, or what happens with plants generally. And the reality is, although we use this term frequently, bloom where planted, plants do bloom where planted, but they do something so much more inspirational. Plants that are in an environment that is suboptimal for them. So in this particular one, I'm showing you a pea plant. Pea plants are legumes. They require lots of nitrogen for their growth and thriving. And so if you plant a legume in a soil that doesn't have sufficient nitrogen, it doesn't just say, well, I've got to do the best I can. These plants have the ability to transform their environments. And that's something that has really inspired me about plants, because I've been told over the years as an African-American woman in science, often the only one, you got to bloom where planted. These are tough environments, but you've got to sort it out. And when I realized that I could not only bloom where I was planted, but transform the environment, I've accepted the option to bloom where planted as long as they recognize that I will transform the environment while there. So how do they do this? Legumes in soil that don't have enough nitrogen are able to produce a chemical language. They produce a language that basically says, is there anyone around who can collaborate with me to enrich the nitrogen in this particular soil? So if you've ever pulled up a pea plant or a bean plant from the soil, there are often little beads on the roots. Those are nodules. These nodules are actually houses that they build. So when the plant sends out a question, basically a signal that says, is there anyone here who can collaborate with me to enrich the nitrogen of the soil? There are bacteria that can hear and pick up that chemical signal. Those bacteria then respond in their own language to say, yes, I am here. I am a bacterium that's able to take nitrogen from the air and chemically transform it into liquid fertilizer. So upon receiving that signal back that there's a collaborator available, the plant then initiates the building of that nodule or the house. The bacteria moves physically into that house. So if you open one of those up and look under the microscope, they're filled with bacteria. So in that house, the bacteria are protected from harsh environment. The plant then sends some of its sugar that it makes through photosynthesis to that house as a gift. And in return, the bacterium shares the fixed nitrogen. And so this is beautiful because the plant is able to transform the environment into one that supports its growth. But the part of the story that's even more beautiful is that the plant and bacterium make more than they need. And that nitrogen gets released into the soil to change the soil for other organisms nearby. So this is the underlying principle of why farmers do rotation of crops. Every few years, they will plant nitrogen fixing crops because those plants grow to make the nitrogen that they need, but they then enrich the entire soil. And so when I think about lessons from plants about environmental justice, I think of the power of understanding that it's not always about some of us coming from spaces where we have good environments to go in and fix the environments of others, but to ask, how can we support them in transforming their environments to produce the things that they need to change their environments. So the next time that you might invite someone to bloom where they're planted, I hope you know you're asking them to also change your world in ways that you may not anticipate. So ultimately for me, I know this is a different perspective of thinking about justice-related work, but I think it has been powerful for me to think about the environment teaching me how to be a better steward in terms of environmental justice. Because the environment and nature have many lessons for us over and over again about how to maintain balance. In the absence of humans, biological communities maintain balance quite well. And that's the problem with climate change, that we're impacting their ability to maintain a natural order of balance. And so the question that I have really taken up on my life is, because I have the privilege to know about plants, what can I learn from them about how to be a better justice-related, justice-inspired steward of the environment? So really, what do we do generally? Generally, what we do a lot of times in environmental spaces is to identify environments that are poor and to go in and try to improve those. And my question is, what do we need to do? Do we need to do some of that? Absolutely, but that can't be the answer alone if we don't also ask how the underlying structures of inequity and bias led us there in the first place. And as we're going in to clean up environments or plant new trees, we also have to ask what structural changes must happen in our engagement as community, in our legal engagement and otherwise, so that we don't slowly retrench into those spaces. So there are certainly wonderful and beautiful stories about urban forests that have been planted in cities to bring green spaces back, to clean up the air, to change the interaction that individuals have. And I would certainly say we need to continue to do more of this, because it does matter not only for physical life, to be living with plants and other organisms, but when you plant the plants, invertebrates and birds and other organisms also move back into those spaces. And even hearing bird song has a positive impact on many people's mental and emotional health. So we need to continue to do some of these things, but we can't. And I should have told you minutes ago that I was a truth teller. I already told you I may make you uncomfortable. We can't continue to do this from a savior perspective, where we bring our money in trees and we go in and have a green spot put into a city. And every time we drive by, we feel good about ourselves for having helped. We also have to ask, how have we maintained these inequities? And how do we break apart those structures as well? So I said a long time ago, based on the work of a very wonderful change leader, Deborah Rowland, she talks about how too frequently what we do in our communities as a change leader is to layer change onto a system. And if we're really going to do the work fully, as talked about by Deborah Rowland, but also Sarah Ahmad, who teaches about inequities in others, we have to ask, how do we get to real change? And what I have said before is that one of the things that we often do is take a vanilla cake and put chocolate frosting on it and tell people they now have chocolate cake. That's still white cake with chocolate frosting. We can't just layer change onto the system. We have to ask, as we're planting new trees, as we're working with people in communities, how do we also get at those underlying structures so that in the end, they have green spaces, but they also have equitable systems that are making choices about and impacting their future lives. So what I say also is that we're not going to get this perfectly. There will be mistakes along the way. And I think one of the biggest problems we have is that we don't prepare for the mistakes proactively. And so sometimes we will go in from a savior perspective and get it wrong, but we can then acknowledge that that's what we've done. And so one of the other lessons that I have learned about how to recover from mistakes in communities also comes from plants. You won't be surprised because I'm obsessed with lessons from plants. But under the core of all of this, not just what do we do, what do we make mistakes, my biggest fear about environmental justice work and about social justice work is that even with our best intentions, with our best resources, that we are simply pursuing better versions of inequality. And I can no longer commit to better inequality as a goal. I will no longer celebrate better inequalities. I really am driven by and committed to collectively moving from espoused commitments to these things to lived. So what do I mean about better inequality? I've shared in many public spaces that I was born and raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. Both of my parents, my late father and my mother, are from rural Arkansas, and they grew up in the Jim Crow South. They were only able to use toilets that were labeled colored only. They couldn't use white only. They could only drink from fountains that were colored only and not white only. My mother might have been the first professor in our family. She is a math whiz, except that in Arkansas, in the spring and summer, the Black children were pulled out of school to pick cotton in the fields alongside their parents, whereas the white children continued their education. So no matter how bright you are, it's hard to keep up when you're being pulled out of school. And so I share this because when my brothers and sisters and I talk with my parents about our state of our world, our parents tell us that things are so much better. And certainly we are better than we used to be. But I have two African-American brothers and an African-American son who live in a country where they see police kill Black men with impunity. So for us, we recognize that we have a better inequality, not equity. Should we be happy for better inequality? Yes. But I'm not going to celebrate that as a victory. And I think that we truly have to be committed to equity. And I've been inspired by a quote that came from Imani Perry, who is an African-American studies professor at Princeton. And in one of her books, Breathe a Letter to My Son, she said that awareness is not a virtue in and of itself, not without a moral imperative. And I share this because I think we're in a moment of greater awareness about environmental justice. We're in a moment of greater awareness about racial inequities, white supremacy, patriarchy, and other issues in this country. But if we don't pair that with a moral imperative, we're only going to use that awareness to take us to slightly better versions of inequality. And we have to have the moral wherewithal, the collective will to move towards equity. So I really would move towards ending by just saying, for me, as you can tell, plants have inspired me. I talk about this a lot in a scientific sense, but tonight, just in any community, I believe that we can look to the natural world for answers and ideas about how to be better humans, about how to live better in community, about how to live sustainable lives. And the last lesson I offer, because of us coming out of, I hope, or being in a different stage of the pandemic, but also when we try this work and we get it wrong, we have to be able to heal from that trauma. And I am really afraid that also about our, increased awareness. As humans, we rush to really heal. We rush to say the pandemic's over, let's move on. We rush to say we've planted trees in this environment, it should be better. But plants don't rush to heal. When there is trauma, when a branch breaks off a tree or a plant is wounded, there are two steps. The plant quickly makes a set of phytochemicals that really serve as kind of an antibacterial or antifungal to clean out the trauma, to clean out the damage. And then they slowly heal over. And you'll see that if you've ever seen a branch broken off a tree, there's often a scab there that covers it over. So plants do a slow stage of really cleaning it out, and then they stop and assess what kind of path towards healing that they need. And I really want to say that as humans, we love to put a Band-Aid on something quickly so we don't see the damage anymore. We like to say, I'm sorry, quickly and move on. And we have to be willing to do this work slowly and completely, not only from awareness, not from realizing that we won't make mistakes, but really moving towards the pursuit of equity and not better inequality. So I just want to say I've written about lots of these types of things in the book Lessons from Plants, but I do know that one of the conversations we had either in writing or elsewise with Lavon was other environmental justice writers that have really inspired me. As I said, I mentioned Robert Bullard, who I've read some of his early work. He's had many books. There are some really recent writers who are taking alternative approaches to thinking about environmental justice. This recent book from Jessica Hernandez, she's an indigenous scientist thinking about indigenous practices and how we incorporate those into the ways that we think about environmental justice. There are other books that say, it's not just about cleaning the environment. It really is about making humans have a better opportunity in terms of social work. A friend of mine, Chanda Prescott Weinstein, is a physicist, but she talks about access to even thinking about the sky as an environmental justice issue. Who gets to dream about these kinds of things? Who's invited to the table? There are many others. And I also would love to hear if you have favorite or recent voices in the environmental justice space. I hope that you would be willing to drop that in the chat. And I will stop here. Thank you again for the invitation to be in community and conversation, and be happy to answer questions if we have time, or to accept criticism or comments as well. And thank you again for the invitation. And I wish you all well as you continue to move forward in your own approaches to environmental justice writing, and mostly also action. Thank you so much.